All right, we're recording, so there we go, we'll give that a try.
Just then.
Thank you, yep. Yep. So just to recap, we had some technology issues and we've just gone through the first portion of the agenda, the consent agenda. We were in the communication items. I'm just to the financial reports. You're gonna notice that revenue for 23 and expenditure for 23, 22, 23, those are updated through June 30th. Though that data will not be final until our audit is complete. And that's very much the way that all of our budget reports work, because we just have to let the time pass between June 30th, things trickle in, and then we have the audit to really finalize all of that information. And then we'll incorporate that into that report as well. I don't know that it's probably as critical as reviewing the audit report, which will happen in probably December-ish, is usually about when it has to be done by December 31st, but we usually get do the audit report in about December. So, but I do wanna just point out that June 30th has been added. And then as you look at the revenues for 23, 24, what we did is, again, we just brought the same information forward so that it builds from our current budget. And then we're gonna track this information year over year. So we'll be able to see how this year compares to last year. You'll see that the adopted budget dollars are put in there. And there are very few expenditures that came through from the big picture on July 31st, okay? So this is the July 31st summary of the revenue. And then you'll see the expenditures in the same capacity. So I've gotten good feedback from these this process, and so I plan to continue this forward for this year, and we can kind of see how we go year over year with our expenditures and our revenues. Okay. So those are the items that I have for my administrative report, and then Rick, I'll turn it over to.
Any questions on the financial part of it? Okay, and then we'll go to committees. Has anybody met?
So I put in just a couple of the facilities, policy, and negotiating committees, because those have been the most active if they've been meeting. And then I don't know, so facilities, I don't know if Thomas, Bruce, or Cheryl, if you want to give a brief update, kind of that, based on that summary.
Well, relative to our last meeting, I thought the last meeting we had was the best meeting I have been to in a long time. My gut feeling is we were taking the logical things of how we accomplish goals and facilities and still accommodating for the budgets that we have to achieve. And it was really good. I thought I liked the plan with the softball field, where we weren't gonna move the field and switch it all around. It just looked like a waste of money. And then we got Kenny involved. I expect it had to do with him. Find out we can move the bathrooms and stuff over by the road, which it seemed like last time we didn't even talk about that. But it was delightful. It was so much. I walked out of there totally pumped that we were gonna get this under control. And what I'm hoping is sometime, and we've talked about it, where we lay out some of these plans. Yep, they may be really pretty big, but do it in parts. Just work away on that plan and get there. And at this rate, we hold, and then all of a sudden something else comes up, and then we hold. Let's get some of this rolling and start setting it up for there. But I was totally pumped. Stuff that I saw come through, just bringing up history of what we watched on that. And I think it was you, Ken, that probably was instrumental in that. We were able to do a whole bunch of stuff it looked like before we couldn't even do, like running water an extra 200 feet instead of having to spend $300,000. Seemed like the water would be less expensive. And it was right. So it was exciting, everything we looked at. And then it was item by item. I believe that we were pretty much on track for trying to accommodate everything. Few areas that we're working on. But it was fun last meeting.
The other thing too is if you start the project and people see something's happening, there might be funding coming from other sources.
Right.
But people aren't gonna give money when they don't see anything happening.
Exactly, and we may have
The
to
first steps, that might open it up and other people are gonna say, oh, this is what you're doing, I can see what you're doing, and so that'd be great.
I don't know if anybody else in the committee had anything to add, but I think it was great.
And I'm just excited that we're going to get moving on it. I mean, we had all these big plans and it was big bucks and we couldn't do it because we needed to raise a bunch of money and nobody was ready to, prepared to raise all that money. And now all of a sudden we've cut it into chunks and we can do things, we can get it going. It's, just getting started is exciting.
Okay. Policy committee, does anybody wanna add anything?
No, we'll be dealing with that here in a few minutes.
Okay. And then, and I just wanted to kind of just make a recognition for all, I guess the board as a whole, all of our negotiating committees will resume shortly. There has been just so much legislative language and changes and things that between the various units and them doing their internal work and then with us doing our internal work to kind of see how they all align and see what that should look like. So I really expect that negotiations will resume here in the near future, so those are the committee updates.
No student representatives here tonight?
Nope.
No old business?
Nope.
So we're gonna move on to the new business, which is handbook approval, which we went through these now
Correct.
the last work session, so everybody's had a chance. Is there any other discussion, or nothing's changed, right?
Correct.
This is exactly what we looked at?
Just cleaned up.
I'll make a motion, we approve those handbooks.
I'll second.
Motion is made and seconded to approve, is there any discussion?
I just wanna add, I thought it was nice that Janelle, you had looked through those and all the people on it to make sure it coordinated with some of the stuff that the legislature is dealing with and some of the changes, so they were excellent.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? They are accepted. Memberships.
So, in June, I presented a couple of memberships and I mentioned that we hadn't received some of the others. So there's two that we are, the Schools for Equity and Education has not come in yet. Resource Training and Solutions has come in, so that one is identified there for you for approval. It would be my recommendation that we remain a member with Resource. That's been Resource has been a valuable resource to us.
I'll make a motion that we approve the membership with Resource Training and Solutions.
I'll second.
Motions, I'll give it to Rachel this time for a second. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It passes. Okay, policies.
All right, so the policy committee did extensive work this last round. There was a lot of legislative updates that impacted a number of policies and procedures throughout the school district. So what I'm going to do is just kind of I'll walk through each of them and kind of just give a real brief overview of them. But at the same time, I do want to just kind of acknowledge that there are policies that other school districts may have that are really driven by legislation. And we had an extensive conversation, the board committee and myself about the pros and cons of that. And unless a policy was required via legislation, most of that committee discussion really kind of led to, if there's changes in the legislature, we need to follow that anyway, so the policy becomes obsolete. So these are policies that are either required or we've had, and the changes that are accompanying those. So policy 102, the equal education opportunity, this is a policy that we've had that has been in place for a number of years. You'll see that it's been revised multiple times, and a lot of the changes that have come in there are purely recommendations from MSBA, and it has to do with some of the Title IX language, and it really is some of the legal correspondence and references to federal regulations. So this is our equal opportunity policy 102. Policy, and committee members, please stop me if there's something that you think of along the way or that you would like to add. Policy 418, drug-free workplace and drug-free schools. Primarily what you're going to notice here is there's a lot of language added around the legalization of marijuana. So really the biggest thing is that even though marijuana is legalized in various parts of the state, you still can't have it on school grounds. It really kind of aligns with the alcohol prohibition on school property. So those have been the biggest changes within that policy. The other thing it does talk a little bit about is just some of the other variations of cannabinoids, okay? We also looked at the tobacco-free environment and possession and use of tobacco, tobacco-related, and so really e-cigarettes or vaping. So this policy identifies more of the vaping prevention, education, the requirements that go along that come into school districts, that when we do smoking education, we need to include the impacts of vaping within that educational criteria as well. So those are some of the general outlines of that change, okay? Just as an aside, all of these, anytime there's a legal reference change, those are always referenced through MSBA as well. Student discipline. So we spent a lot of time talking about the student discipline policy. There are a number of changes that the committee reviewed, and the recommendation is going to be to adopt the changes as presented. Again, a lot of this is driven by legislature and legislative action. So the Minnesota legislature has had extensive conversation about non-exclusionary practices. So in the most general summary, making sure that kids aren't suspended for extended amounts of time, and we are implementing alternative practices to suspension and keeping kids in classrooms. For us as a school district, this is not life-changing. This isn't something that we have really had extensive issues with, so I don't really foresee our staff having I guess a big like aha moment. We're like, oh shoot, I can't do that, you know. I'm not going to say there are not some procedural pieces that we have to follow that have not been legislated before, but our building principals are meeting with our buildings to make sure that they understand, because they were also incorporated into our handbooks. Okay, so this work that came through the discipline policy is driven by the legislature. Okay. Again, you'll see all of the changes. There are a number of them in there, and a lot of it is about non-exclusionary. One piece that I will call out is that we do have to address the use of cell phones in our policy, which is going to come up a little bit later, but that was referenced a couple of different times in statute. Bullying prohibition, that's policy 514 that the group reviewed. As you walk through this one, this is adding the couple of different pieces of language so that bullying cannot happen on social media and have no consequence at school. Similarly, it can't happen on a field trip on the bus and have just because it didn't happen at school, it doesn't apply to me. Okay, so it kind of expanded where the coverage of some of those areas, of some of that implication. The other thing that's in here is there's a expanded language around malicious and sadistic conduct. I think really what it is it's trying to get behind the heart of behavior and conduct that is just outright nasty, just hurtful, mean, purposeful, intentional, really trying to address some of those types of concerns. That is, so that's the malicious and sadistic conduct. verbiage that was added throughout the policy as well. So those are the changes that were reviewed for the bullying prohibition. The next policy that was reviewed, so this was so a couple of policy series ago, the policy committee reviewed the Narcan, the use of the opioid antagonist, am I saying that right? Opioid antagonist, and so if somebody would overdose on an opioid, we would have something for that. The legislature required us to do it, and they have required that we have it accessible. We have not gone through the policy adoption, and we talked about at the committee level that we've got to logistically think about what makes sense for us. The biggest piece that's coming out through, and again, this is one of the benefits of being a member of Resource Training and Solutions, they help us manage all of those types of supplies and kind of procedures. And one of the conversation items is, if you have it locked in your nurse's office, is it gonna do what you intend for it to be doing in the first place? Or do we put it into places like where our AED devices are, so that if somebody would have access to it, they could be able to use it? One of the things that's the most important for our community to hear is that wherever this is, unless somebody is experiencing an opioid overdose, they will not be harmed if they would get it and use it, okay? That was my biggest concern when I looked at where it could be, if it was accessible in like our AED boxes. So we've been talking about what's gonna make the most sense for our district, because we are required to have them, at least one per building, but we also have to think about what makes sense and continue the conversation with our school nurse about, how are we going to, what seems to make the most sense. The policy back to, I think last time we reviewed it, was optional because it was still just a possibility. Then the legislature mandated that we have to have it, okay? So at this point, there's not, that we have not currently adopted it, okay? Internet acceptable use and safety policy. So one of the things in here that was really the discussion point, and it was a discussion that was held administratively between the principals and myself, and then I brought that conversation to the policy committee about cell phone use. I'm seeing a lot of prohibition of cell phones in schools in general. I mean, it really is becoming a much more, if you watch MSBA's news briefs that are coming out, if you're paying attention to any news articles, a lot of school districts are just making a blanket prohibition. So what we really talked about is not a lot is changing at the elementary, and at the secondary, the biggest thing is that they are not to be out and accessible during instructional time. So it really is limiting the use so that a teacher has the ability to enforce if a student has a cell phone out in class. They've got some ability to say, yeah, it's not happening. We're not going to do that. So we're continuing. That is the difference, is that we now have to address it in our policies. So that's something that has changed, and that's why you're seeing it come through a lot more public discussion at board levels, because it's now a required component of policy. Use of peace officers and the crisis team. So there's some of the biggest things with the use of a peace officer is, and for us, this is not going to be problematic, but where our students that have very specific behavior intervention plans that's linked to their disability, sometimes students that have a very prescriptive plan in districts that this has become a little bit more problematic, I'll suggest. law enforcement might be used as a backup because, they weren't able to, engage in certain types of restraints, so then they would call law enforcement. This changes your ability to do that, okay? Again, this has not been an issue for our school district. I think we've had a really healthy working relationship with our liaison officers. Our liaison officers don't step in unless they're invited in. And especially for students with IEPs, they're not part of our preventative proactive plan. Does that make sense? The other piece that I'll just call out and acknowledge is that law enforcement is no longer able to use prone restraint within a school setting. And that's regardless of whether it's a student with a disability or any student in the school district. Prone restraint is really a hold that places a child face down on the ground, okay? That again has not been in use and allowed in special education for years, so that is nothing new for this policy, but it is something that I know law enforcement is, they have on their radar because it's different for them, okay? One of the things that I think everybody needs to know is that when law enforcement becomes involved at the school's request, we no longer are in control of what happens with that student and to kind of set the outcomes. So law enforcement really is governed by their own sets of rules and regulations. And our law enforcement, again, has taken a very proactive approach within our districts they teach DARE, they just are out and they're present walking through the buildings. Again, trying to create a much more relationship with our law enforcement officials. So that's the policy updates recommended from MSBA for policy 532. School meals policy, biggest thing that's been changed in this policy is the reference to free lunches for all students. Biggest thing that we talked about at this at the board level was maintaining the procedure that if a student has more than a $10 negative balance, they won't be allowed to charge. Now, in past, we had to allow students to eat and charge because you couldn't withhold food from students. That's not what this is talking about. This is talking about anything extra. So if you have an extra meal, or if you take an extra breakfast, or you want a second breakfast, or whatever, second chance breakfast still is cash. But if you would come through and have breakfast and you're extra hungry and you want a second McMuffin or a second scone, I'll just take my two favorites. You have to have money in your lunch account to pay for those. And so this really identified, it carried forward some of our practice from in years past, but this does not prohibit us from telling a student that they can't go into the negative to buy extra because meals are provided. Okay. So those are the biggest pieces that I'll kind of walk through there. The other thing that talks about, and we've talked about this at the policy committee in cycles past, is that we still cannot meal shame. Meal shaming was really when you would have a student that was in the negative, you'd get, and I remember, I'll be honest, I remember going through and getting a stamp on my hand because I didn't have money in my account. Well, those aren't practices this has not been anything that our district had to change because we haven't done this for years, so. Okay. Okay, so that was school meals. So the school district curriculum and instruction goals. Changes here are to reflect. So this is to bring in the language that was added for our from the legislature that we have to be considering in our next cycles of curriculum and development, and also they're going to be coming into these statutory requirements that are, I am drawing a blank on standards, our educational standards. So each, so like English language arts has a set of standards, our social studies has a set of standards. All of these areas are now kind of defined in the policy because they are now defined in statute, okay? So that's why they have come into the policy. You're going to see, again, an ongoing discussion about, in here, we're gonna start talking about our district advisory council. And we've really used our world's best workforce to kind of talk about curriculum, how things are aligned, how our educational practices based on data are meeting the standards. And so these are some of the things that are incorporated into this policy. Again, this was vetted through the Minnesota School Board Association's attorney, comparing the language that was in the policy to the language that came through in Minnesota statute. Okay? So the board didn't make any further changes to that because they were driven by statute. Okay. So the curriculum development, so this is where we see a little bit more about the a little bit more discussion about the team. So this is something that I realized, so the district advisory committee, and again, I believe we were using our world's best workforce in that capacity. But in reading the definition and how it's working and how it is intended to be, you'll notice if you think back to the handbook that was a recommended addition, committee addition. So we're gonna take a look at pulling in a district advisory council or committee that's a little bit more robust and meets some of these requirements that are identified through MSBA that we should be having in according to statute. The other thing that this starts talking about is the READ Act. The Minnesota READ Act is, it changes, some of you might remember the Read Well by 3rd grade and hearing about that. Some of the requirements within the READ Act that are the most general, I guess, that I could very just kind of highlight to at a high level is that instead of waiting until kids are at the end of 3rd grade to determine if they read well, we're determining at the end of every grade if they're reading well. And if they're not, then what are we doing? Okay, so some of those changes make a lot of sense. Some of them are I think going to really help out. They're not gonna be hard for us because we have the Letters Initiative and we've done a lot of the work proactively to make sure that we have screening in place, we have instruction that is scientifically based, literacy focused instruction. So we've got a lot of things that are already going that the policy introduces. School district accountability. I have to look at what this one was again. So this is linking the our district advisory committee and how they are presenting and making sure that our curriculum cycle is following the assessment. So it's linking together curriculum, accountability, world's best workforce. We've had a lot of initiatives in education that are very isolated, and so I think there's some attempts to try to bring things together, and that's part of what is referenced in this policy revision. Okay, again, you'll see district advisory council or committee was just added, the word district instead of just advisory committee. Okay, and again, that's the same. That's not a different committee. It's the same one across all of these policies. So. Transportation, there are some revisions to transportation. Again, Cassie did a nice job outlining some of those that came through as recommendations from MSBA again. So one of the discussion items that we had, and you'll see in here, there is the training. One of the discussion items that we had at the policy committee level was how are we certain that kids who move into our school midway through the year are part of bus safety. And what we kind of surmised is that every student who has been attending school if they go through in the first, I believe it's the first, there's a amount of time, and I'm not gonna recall off the top of my head, but in the first X amount of time of a school year, if they're attending in school, they're gonna get the training because everyone's required to have it. Whether they're a walker, they're still gonna ride a bus for field trips. So they're all gonna be part of the training that's required for us to meet the requirements of this policy. The other thing that this did is it does spell out the steps for if a student has infractions on the bus. One of the things that's unique to us, and it's not unique across the state, but because we contract with our transportation, we have a really a very solid working relationship between the bus company and our district administration, so that our district administration is doing the accountability. The bus company is doing the communication, but it's our district administration that's handling discipline if there are bus infractions. Which is really the way I believe it should be, because our transportation company is a contract. They're an extension of us, but they're not our administration, okay? So those are the updates. These are the same that were in the handbooks, so they correspond and they correlate. And then you're gonna see updated references to statute and federal law. One thing I'm gonna add that is really exciting, especially because we have a couple of vans that this really worked for. It used to be that anytime you had a type 3 vehicle and it was over, I'm gonna look to Ken, it used to be over 12 years, 10 years, anytime it was over 12 years, regardless if it was completely functional or not, you had to retire it from your fleet. This law changed, and that was a big yay, because that brought another vehicle back into, we just had to have it inspected. The caveat to that is it still has to pass inspection, okay? But, so that was exciting, and so that's referenced in this policy as well.
Applaud that too,
I
because I
know.
don't think you can find vehicles, is the other problem.
That is a big problem, you're absolutely right, okay? So all of these changes that were presented and walked through with the committee, again, came from MSBA recommendations. And not a lot of substantial changes, more so revision of the practices, and then like the practices of when, and then it also changed our timeline for training. So those are the big changes of the transportation policy. Okay.
These have all been vetted by your policy committee at a very long meeting that we had. And we're not voting on them today, just the first reading, so they'll be coming up at our next meeting in September.
Yep.
Board meeting.
Yep. And then these are available for any comment or questions in the district office. Okay.
Okay, then we have upcoming meetings. The paraprofessional negotiations, second meeting, or was that third maybe?
It'll be the third
Yeah, West Central Education
board
Board
meeting.
meeting.
Yep.
We'll be meeting on the 12th.
Yep.
For work session and the general meeting of C. Okay. So are we ready to do the next thing?
Yep, you can go ahead and read what you
Okay.
need to read.
When's our September 26th? We should add that. We should add some of that for our second board meeting. We have just a work session on there.
Thank you.
I was like, what's there? Don't we have one board meeting next month? We should have two.
You're right, thank you, Thomas.
Yep.
And board meeting 26.
Six, yeah.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is a closed session. The open meeting law, Minnesota statutes, section 13D.05, subsection 3B allows the board to close a meeting pursuant to the attorney-client privilege. The purpose of the closed session is for the board to meet with the district's attorney to discuss the status of pending litigation and provide advice concerning a proposed resolution of the litigation. It is in the district's best interest for the board to obtain legal advice in a confidential setting to maintain the attorney-client privilege. Pursuant to the law I have cited, I will now hereby entertain a motion that this meeting be closed. There's a motion, or a motion by Ron,
I'll second.
Thomas seconds the motion. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Closed session.
Okay, it is 6:15. Okay, the meeting was opened at 7:18. Board Chair,
Okay, board chair is seeking a motion to approve the settlement agreement as discussed with legal counsel in closed session.
Make the motion.
Thomas makes a motion, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Bruce.
just a moment, please. Okay.
We're gonna take a roll call vote.
Bruce,
Bruce? Yay. Thomas?
Yay.
Ron? No. Rachel?
Yay.
Rick? Yay. Gerald?
Yay.
Cheryl?
Aye.
Okay, it passes on a vote of 6-1.
okay,
I'll make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
It's adjourned. Good.